The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anush Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. I hope you're all well. Today, we've decided to try out a bit of a new format, and I'd very much welcome your feedback on it, actually. Excitedly, there seems to be a lot of momentum at the moment in the industry with a regular stream of news from around the world. So I'd like to try and do a bit of a news roundup once a month or so with a few different panelists to get a good spread of views. And there's no better place to start than the recent announcements from the incoming coalition government in Germany. Very exciting for the European industry. And certainly I've seen on a personal level from various clients that there's been a lot of interest from North America in these developments too. But as with everything, the devil is in the detail, and there has been precious little of that so far. So I thought I'd invite three wise heads onto the show to discuss what's happening, what might happen, and when. Joining me are former guest Alfredo Pascual from Seed Innovations, Franziska Katterbach from Khiron Life Sciences, and Tom Blickman from the Transnational Institute. Guys, welcome.
Thanks a lot. It's good to be here.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Good to be with you again. Exciting year ahead in Germany.
Yes. Thank you, Alfredo. Yeah, thank you guys for joining me. So look, we'll get stuck in pretty quickly, but maybe if all of you could just say hello and introduce yourself and say what you do, that would be good. Franzi, do you want to kick off?
Yes, for sure. So hello, buenos dias and guten Tag. My name is Franziska Katterbach and I'm the president of Khiron Life Sciences in Europe.
Great, thank you. Tom, do you want to say hello to everyone?
Yeah, my name is Tom Blickman. I work with the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam, and we have been looking at international drug policy for the past 25 years and basically trying to reform international drug policy. We specialize a little bit in the UN drug control conventions, and I'm basically also looking at the developments with cannabis.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Alfredo, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to be here. So my name is Alfredo, and I work as investment analyst for Seed Innovations, which is a closed-ended investment fund listed in the AIM Stock Exchange in London. And we focus on investing in the cannabis industry. We do have already a balanced, actively managed, multi-sector and jurisdiction portfolio, which includes investments in Germany as well.
Brilliant. Well, I've got a crack team here, so thank you for joining me. We'll get straight into it. So Germany is already by far the biggest medical cannabis market in Europe. I think north of 120,000 patients, although that number is probably a little bit out of date. But what's actually been announced recently in relation to recreational cannabis? Alfredo, do you want to give us a quick overview about the recent news?
Sure. I guess there are two ways of answering that. A very short and easy way to answer it, which is saying what was announced, and a longer answer, which probably will be discussed throughout the whole conversation, which is what was not announced and what we expect to happen in the following year or years. So starting with the easy part, what was announced what was published is that the new government in Germany intends to legalize recreational cannabis, adult use, however you want to call it. And they wrote down that promise in the coalition agreement in Germany. The literal translation that they use is coalition contract, although maybe the lawyer here will tell us if it's really a contract or not. I have my doubts there because it's not binding and you cannot sue them if they don't do what they promised to do. But there's a political willingness of the incoming government, or the new government already, to legalize adult use cannabis. And from the wording of what they have in the coalition agreement, it looks like it will be, let's say, full legalization, meaning not just decriminalization or not just growing at home, which we don't even know if it's going to be included, but some sort of commercial legalization that would allow selling cannabis in licensed shops. That's about it in terms of what we have. We can go a couple of steps back and say that what we have now in Germany is a coalition government, that it's the first time that these three parties govern together on a federal level, on a Germany-wide level. So this is in a way, a new experiment for Germany, not just with cannabis, but with this new coalition government. And if we look in more detail in what has happened before the coalition was formed, and we look at the programs of the individual three parties, we have there two parties that have in their programs, individual programs, and with this I mean the Green Party and the FDP, also called the Liberals. They had in their programs that they wanted to fully legalize cannabis. And the other party, which was the one that had the most votes in the past elections, and the one of the new chancellor, Olaf Scholz, had in its program something a little bit more limited, because what they had was that they wanted to basically decriminalize cannabis and start some pilot experiments. But they had to come together, agree on something, on many things actually. One of the many things that they had to agree on was cannabis. And the result of that is basically 2 paragraphs in a very long document, the coalition agreement, with what I just said.
Thank you, Alfredo. It's really good that you pointed out that the three parties may not share the complete same view on how to approach this. So thank you for highlighting. And it will be key on how these things kind of come through. Tom, did you want to add something there quickly?
Yeah, it's like 3 sentences in a very big coalition document. Everybody looks at the first 2 sentences and forget about the third one, and that says that they will evaluate the law or the policy after 4 years. And that to me seems to indicate that it is a little bit more like what the SPD, the Social Democrat Party, actually wants, and that's a kind of pilot project, which will be evaluated after 4 years. So that is maybe also, it probably all depends on how the next negotiations will go, but we should not forget that the Minister of Health is a SPD man, Karl Lauterbach. He's from the Social Democrats, and he will probably have the lead. So yeah, I'm still not fully convinced that after 4 years we have a functioning cannabis market.
And by the way, the new Minister of Health will be very busy with other more important issues, right?
Yeah, I think there's some kind of pandemic going on, isn't there, apparently?
Yeah, and you could draw a parallel with what has happened in Luxembourg, of course, where in 2018 a similar government, also a traffic light government with Social Democrats, Liberals and the Greens, also announced to legalize cannabis and sell it in licensed shops. Well, we saw what came out of that, and that is basically a decriminalization, and people are allowed to grow 4 plants. So that is maybe a warning sign. Of course, Luxembourg is 600,000 people, and Germany is more than 100 times as big and an economic powerhouse in Europe. So that, of course, makes a difference, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah, really good to get. This is the kind of detail that I wanted to pull out from here. And Franzi, would you mind if you could maybe explain a little bit what sort of the next steps needs to happen for this to actually become law in Germany?
Yeah, thank you. So I think we have to distinguish between 2 levels. There are formal requirements in a law change, but also material requirements. And I cannot agree more than what Tom and Alfredo said. What we've seen now is an intention to make a law. So we generally have formal requirements for a new law, and a new law doesn't happen overnight. So that's for sure. And on the frame of the law, we're not clear how it's going to be looked like, other than that they're intending to have somehow an adult use of cannabis in Germany legalized. So from the formal side, the new government of the 3 parties has just been confirmed yesterday. So officially now then they can start working. And yeah, it starts with the drafting of a law. So they have to start drafting a law. Maybe they will look into previous laws, drafts on the legalization of cannabis. And there are lots of questions that might arise. And once they did this, there are several hearings in the one parliament of Germany, which is the Bundestag. And after this, and depending on the content of the laws, they will have to pass it by the other chamber, which is the Bundesrat. That is just the formal side. But I think what's more interesting to everybody is the material side. So how does the law really look like? And from that standpoint, we really have to decide the questions, who, what, and when. And this is a breakdown to questions like, where can the product come from? Is it grown in Germany? What quality standards do we apply? Do we apply the kind of known suspects like European GMP? Who can import? How's the license scheme looking like? Who can buy in the end the product and who can sell it? And I think these are questions which need to be answered, and they will have to look into lots of details. not least into the UN Convention of 1961. Because what we shouldn't forget about it, that the treaty, the international treaty, the UN Convention, does not allow for recreational or so-called adult use cannabis. And maybe it's interesting to look into our Canadian partners who did the legalization. And when they did it, the International Narcotics Control Board commented on that. And I will cite this, that the government of Canada has contributed to weakening the international legal drug control framework and is undermining the rules-based international order. So obviously, the INCB does not like recreational cannabis. And this is a topic which the German government has to deal with.
Yeah, and very interesting to bring the UN Convention into that. But as far as I know, there've been no real any real sanctions in relation to that. It's more a kind of a disapproving look, if you like.
And warning letters, I guess. So Canada did receive some notifications, but you're absolutely right. There has no enforcement been yet.
But there's another thing there. I mean, yeah, there has no enforcement in the sense of blocking medicines trade or harsh things. But you also need to consider another part of the new government, which is a government that wants to work as much as possible on a European and international level. It is not a government that wants to do things in a unique German way and won't care about the international community, at least when it comes to other topics. So I wonder how the new German government will justify legalizing recreational cannabis in a quite unique way, like Canada or Uruguay did, while at the same time saying that they want to work and decide as much as possible on an EU level. So I'm not saying that it's not going to be possible. I'm just saying that there's going to be some sort of contradiction there that they will have to find a way to solve.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I cannot agree more with Alfredo on that. It's the one thing to have an intent. And I think it was great for the industry that they announced it because it put some spotlight on the medical industry as well. But 100% I agree with Alfredo that there are lots of topics which need to be looked into and decide on what's going to happen. And this will take time. And for good reasons, I don't expect this to happen overnight. For sure not.
Yeah, and you also have to take into account not only the UN conventions, basically the 61 and the 88 convention, which require countries to have penal sanction on recreational cannabis possession at least. But you also have to look at the EU law, and EU law is for a large extent based on the UN Drug Control Convention. Every country that is part of the European Union has to underwrite the UN drug conventions, but there's also the EU law, basically the framework decision of 2004, which also does not allow cannabis at a large scale. It does allow cannabis cultivation for personal use. So that's what you see happening in Luxembourg, home cultivation, that is allowed. So that's why they came up with that proposal. You can decriminalize personal possession for personal use and also home cultivation, but not large scale cultivation for recreational use. And EU law does have more possibilities to have sanctions than the UN Drug Control Conventions also have a possibility for sanctions, but that is a very, very, very rude and sanctioned system. But the EU, can have fines for not complying with the EU law. So there is much more a problem there. I mean, it's all possible to find a way around it, or basically that's maybe not the right phrase, but to have mechanisms that are allowed in international law. Well, you could try to amend the 61 convention, but that is almost impossible with current setup of countries. What you could do is what Bolivia has done in 2013, withdraw from the convention, make a reservation regarding recreational cannabis use, and try to re-accede into the convention. Bolivia succeeded in doing that, but I question if that is possible with cannabis. Nobody cares about the traditional use of coca leaves, but a lot of countries, I think, would object, a country coming back into the conventions with a reservation on cannabis.
Tom, I think I was only going to emphasize that and say that it is a very important point, the one that you are raising, because something also that Franzi mentioned, this is not going to be the first bill that is going to be written in the German parliament to legalize cannabis. And one of the perhaps more comprehensive bills that we have from recent history is the one of the Green Party called the Cannabis Control Bill in English language, that many want to resuscitate now because that bill failed last year to be approved, I mean. And of course, the Green Party being one of the parties of the coalition, they will want probably to use that bill as the foundation for the new bill at minimum, if not to use that bill as a whole. And I remember reading in detail that bill last year before the voting was going to happen, although we knew it was not going to be approved, but I wanted to know how they were going to justify things on an international level. And it's exactly what you say, Tom, that the plan that they had written down in that bill was to do like Bolivia did with coca leaves, which I think I agree with you here that there's a little bit of wishful thinking there, because in the case of Bolivia, it was an indigenous tradition. It was coca leaf, and fewer than, how many is it? Like a third of the signatories of the convention opposed Bolivia re-entering under that reservation. But in the case of Germany, to re-enter with a reservation on cannabis, that's not going to happen automatically. And even if it happens, it also could take years. Remind me, Tom, how long it is, but I think like states can oppose that up to 1 year, even after that is done. I don't know exactly the timeline there, but it's a long process and anything but uncertain.
Yeah, it took Bolivia 2 years, if I remember well. So you first have to step out, and then there is a year period that you can get back in, and then there's a period of time that states can object to that, to a state re-entry.
And no certainty, right? Because
no certainty, nothing.
If more than 1/3 of the countries signatories to the convention, which are basically almost every country of the world, oppose that, then that's not going to be a solution, which doesn't mean that it cannot be done, only that they will have to think about other solutions or do like Uruguay or Canada. But the proposal that they had in the Green Party bill of last year, I think it has a little bit of a leap of faith there, and they will need to think that a little bit further when it comes to the 1961 convention.
Yeah, but there is another.
I think what is wrapping this up, we have lots of unknowns, and it's really going to be very exciting to see how the German government is solving that.
Now, I want to mention one other possibility, which is something that might work, and that is an interstate modification of the UN Drug Control Conventions. That is that a group of like-minded countries, in this case, a group of countries who want to legally regulate recreational cannabis, can come together and make basically a reservation on the UN Drug Conventions and say that between those countries there is a different regime around cannabis. And that does not require withdrawing from the convention and re-entering. You can just have a group of like-minded countries, and that group is slowly emerging. We have Uruguay as the first one already, Canada. Actually, the US should also adhere, because what they are doing, although it's still prohibited at the federal level, but they should also enforce that prohibition at state level, which they're not doing. Then you have the Netherlands, you have Switzerland, you have Luxembourg, you have Mexico, all countries who do want to regulate, maybe some states, Jamaica in the Caribbean also. So you can form a like-minded group of countries and say, between those countries, we will have a different regime around cannabis. And for the rest, we adhere to the conventions as everybody else. But between us, we make sure that there is no leakage of what we do to the countries who are not part of that group. And that could work. And you don't need there's no withdrawal from the conventions, and you don't need to re-accede. So that is the advantage of doing it in that way. Also, and that is because that would make it possible to have import and export between those countries. Because what will happen now is that every country that has legally regulated cannabis has a domestic industry. There is import and export with medical cannabis, but that's allowed, but not with the recreational. So it looks like that if Germany goes this way, and such an interstate modification process will take time also, there will be no import and export for I guess 4 or 5 years.
One more word about interstate modifications. Allow me to promote a little bit the paper that you have published in the TNI website from 2018. Remind me, I think it was written by Martin Jelsma, John Walsh, and others. And it's a great paper. I mean, everyone that wants to understand how this interstate modification of the UN drug control system could work, I recommend downloading that paper and reading it, because even if it is from 2018, it's so actual now.
Thank you. Yeah, Alfredo, please send me the link and I'll share that when we push the show out. So I think, look, to summarize, it's very complicated, but I think to go a bit deeper than that, first of all, the rules and the detail needs to be worked out at a German level, and then that needs to be worked on in the context of both European and international treaty obligations, which it's difficult to kind of predict now. But maybe we can actually go into some of that detail. Tom, would you mind just maybe identifying some of the key policy areas that really need to be mapped out in order for this to be kind of made into law, and what are some of the challenges that you'd expect?
Well, yeah, there are the limitations. So yeah, you can see a little bit what happened in Luxembourg. Basically, they had the same announcement, what was it, 3 years ago, and you see how they backtracked on what they could do. So, and yeah, EU law is basically saying, well, you cannot have cultivation, large-scale cultivation for recreational cannabis, but we do allow some leeway, and every state can decide a little bit what room of maneuver they have there for personal use, cultivation and possession. So yeah, it could well be that it goes that way. Maybe it goes more to a model that the Uruguay model, which is much more strictly state controlled than the commercial models you have in Canada and in the US. So you have like home cultivation, cannabis clubs, which is basically a group of people cultivating for their own use. So that could maybe fit within that framework. And then you have distribution through licensed shops, in the case of Uruguay, through pharmacies. And Christian Mittner, the chairman of the Liberals, the FDP, has also hinted at that there should be sales in pharmacies. So yeah, that is a more restrictive model than what we see in North America. And I think that the Germans are, like most European countries, not that keen on a commercial market with a substance that is psychoactive, and that there are, I mean, I'm fully in favor of legalizing and regulating cannabis, but there are some risks and harms there for public health. So I think there will be more cautious than a North American model.
Yeah. And so some of the things that, if we're going to look to North America, which we're going to talk about in a second, but, you know, typically there are lots of rules around licensing in itself. So who is allowed to get a license, and that whole process that needs to be mapped out. But then there's also things like marketing restrictions as well, and how do you manage people driving and all of this sort of things? You know, these all need to be worked on, right?
I would say that we are talking here about a lot of, let's say, difficult questions, both on an international level in terms of how it's going to be justified, and also more practical questions like driver's license in Germany. Of course, we don't have the answers to all of those questions in terms of how it's going to be done. I don't even think that the new government has all the answers. They will need to think about it, discuss this, and find solutions to this. But the great news here, I think, is that in a way, the genie is out of the bottle. There's no way that they can go back and say, we will do nothing now. They could do it, but they would have to pay a huge political cost. So they will have to do something. Cannabis will become more mainstream in Germany, will be in the news more often. So I think that's the very positive step, even if this takes longer than what some may wish.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think we're all very excited and happy that this is a positive step. How long that takes is another question. So I'm going to ask all of you, what's your estimate on a timeline? And obviously no one knows, so we will all take it with a pinch of salt. But Franzi, do you want to give that a go? So what do you think on a rough timescale that this could, what's best case and worst case from your opinion?
I'm so sorry. I have to tell you, my crystal ball is not working today. So it's really hard to predict. So I don't feel that we're going to see a lot in 2022. So I totally agree what Tom and Alfredo said. It's great that we just have the conversation about it, right? Because with this announcement of the government, we start thinking of all this stuff, like what happens. And I mean, we Germans love our cars and our driver's license, right? And that we at least start thinking about that, and like not banning it from the reality, but looking at it as like, okay, we have to regulate it. We have to find solution, because that's just the reality. Our ban didn't work. I think this is already helping the whole industry. But when this is going to happen, I think the lawmaking will take time. The hearings will take time. I'm not so sure what priority this law will have amongst all the other issues Germany is going through, especially with COVID and all the other stuff. So I don't think we will see a law in 2022. But honestly, this is something it's hard to predict. But I hope that the government, which is voted for the next 4 years, will find a solution within this period. That's my hope.
Okay, that's quite balanced projection. Tom, do you want to give it a go next?
Yeah, I'm even more cautious in that sense. I don't think we'll see anything in the next 2 or 3 years. Again, I look a little bit at what Luxembourg has done, same kind of coalition, very bold announcement, and then they started to realize, hey, there's more to this than we realized when we put that in a coalition agreement. And also we already know that the European Commission has asked questions to Luxembourg and also to the Netherlands with the experiment that is going on there on what they are exactly doing. And that could be the first step. I'm not saying it will happen, but it could be the first step towards an infringement procedure by the European Commission to say, well, you are violating EU law here and also the international conventions. And that is not allowed. It will also mean that they will have to negotiate at the European level what to do. And of course, the situation is very complicated. I mean, you have states who want to legally regulate, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland but it's part of Schengen, so it's also Malta now with the new law. But you also have hardline states like France and Sweden who don't want to know anything about this. So that will be a very difficult negotiation, and that will also take quite some time, to see how that works out. And Germany is a very legalistic country. They don't want to have a very big interest in keeping Europe together. So they're not going to rock the boat with this on that level.
That's really good context there. Okay, so Tom and Franzi have been relatively conservative. Alfredo, I want you to be really optimistic here.
First of all, I think Tom raised an interesting issue there and what he mentioned about France opposing cannabis reform. And I think we also need to look at this in the new context of European politics, because I think it's fair to assume that there will be some sort of shift of power from Germany to France on a European level. I'm not saying that it certainly would happen, but I think it's reasonable to expect that now that Merkel is not leading Germany anymore. I think the new Chancellor of Germany will have to, in a way, prove himself on an international level, especially if he wants to do things in a different way. So France could certainly be a hurdle for the new German government to legalize cannabis. But answering your question, look, from my, let's say, investor mindset, I need to prepare for all scenarios. So I'm both optimistic and negative at the same time, and I need to be both. So I think this is a highly political issue. Anything can happen. So let's say from an optimistic point of view, unexpected things could happen, such as, for example, that next year, the new government needs to divert attention from certain issues to cannabis, which is all over the news. And then they decide to actually focus on cannabis legalization as one of the priorities, right? I mean, it's fair to assume that cannabis is not the top priority, considering what's going on today in Germany and the world, especially with the pandemic, which is the number one issue for the new government right now as we speak. But hey, I mean, it could become a priority if they want the media to talk about cannabis instead of talking about something else, right? Obviously, I'm just speculating here. So I would be surprised if there's a law in 2022, but I don't discard it and I need to prepare for that. But I tend to align more with Franzi and Tom's view that because of all what we've been speaking about in terms of all the questions that need to be answered and for which there is no answer today, this will probably take a little bit longer. And also, if we consider international experiences, and Tom has been mentioning the great example of Luxembourg, but there are other examples as well of countries which had or have governments that have declared the intention to legalize recreational cannabis and that have not been able to do it for different reasons. Mexico comes to my mind, with the Senate still hesitant, I would say, for lack of a better word, to legalize cannabis, despite the law already having been approved in the lower house. We even have the example of the US. Everyone was super excited at the end of 2020 with the election results and Democrats gaining control of the government. And we all, even myself, we all expected some sort of federal reform as soon as possible. And that hasn't happened. Again, the Senate in the US is hesitant to approve any type of federal cannabis reform, even if they could do it with the majorities that they have. And there are other examples like Israel. Exactly 1 year ago, we had headlines in Israel saying that the government had a plan to legalize cannabis within 9 months. They even had a timeline to do it. And then something can happen, right? Like the government failing. And now Israel has a new coalition and they went like 10 steps back because this coalition is highly unlikely that it will legalize. And I wish obviously the very best to the new coalition government in Germany. But within the realm of possibilities, we also have the possibility that the new government won't last 4 years. Maybe something happens with these three parties that are governing together for the first time. So there are lots of uncertainties there. So I think I'm speaking too much here, but I agree, especially with what Francis said. I don't have the crystal ball, and I don't think anyone has the crystal ball, because there are just too many variables. And I think the best everyone can do is to prepare for both positive and not so positive scenarios.
You could also say, well, there could be intermediary steps.
Awesome. That's very important. Yeah.
Pointing to the example of Luxembourg, which now decriminalizes and allows home cultivation, that could also be a step that Germany could take.
That's a very important point.
Absolutely. And I think governments wrapping their heads around this issue is already, as I mentioned before, it's helping, right? We start taking this seriously. We just accept as a nation that we cannot just prohibit it and then it's gone. We have to say, okay, we have to deal with it and take it seriously. And I think that's the first step. Talk about it and destigmatize it. And I think this is a good step.
Absolutely. It's in the public conversation, which is great. But I think I tend to agree with all of you that, looking at other territories is probably quite good to see. Just things take longer than anyone wants. And just the sheer level of detail that's needed, I assume they'll probably start with a cautious approach, given various sort of political partners at an international level. But moving on from the kind of the politics side of things and more onto sort of the industry side of things, Franzi, maybe you can just sort of give us your perspective as on behalf of Khiron. There's a lot of excitement from the industry in Germany and internationally. How are Khiron viewing this news?
Yeah, thanks for that. So for us, it's generally great news because what we're facing every day, I mean, we're a global medical cannabis company, but we're still faced the stigmatization of medical cannabis even. And this announcement is already helping us to destigmatize it, even for patients. But as we all agreed, it will take still some time until this law is coming, and who knows how it's going to look like. So for us, we're a patient-focused company and we think backwards. So for us, it's the patient needs where we start thinking, and then we work backwards and see how can we solve for this problem the patient has. And for us, it's just really helping that the industry is talking about it, that there is more focus and attention about it, but we are still a medical cannabis company, and we will just see when the law comes, we will be prepared. But we do see also the positive effects on the discussion that might have on the medical side, because people now say, oh, cannabis is something legal. I might go to my doctor, because the reality in Germany is no matter how the law comes, the medical cannabis will still be something covered by the health insurance. And I think this is very important also in comparison to any other nation worldwide. The medical cannabis side will still be something where the patient, when it goes to the doctor and gets the script, both the doctor visit, but also the script will be covered by insurance if that's the right treatment. And I think that more people are now hearing in the radio everywhere like, oh, cannabis can be legal. They might go to the doctor and say, hey, I need this as a medicine and I don't want to go to the black market anymore. I think it just really is also for our community. It's something, okay, let's talk about it. Let's destigmatize it. And for us as Cairn, we just say, okay, this is helping our patient. And in the future, whatever the law will look like, we have our team, we have our sales force, we have our connections. So we will be prepared however the law will look like.
Yeah, I think that's good. And it's sort of reinforcing what we've talked about. It's just more prevalent in the conversation, and more people asking their doctors for it will hopefully lead to more doctor education in general. Alfredo, obviously work a lot in the UK as well as just generally across Europe and the rest of the world. What are you hearing from people outside Germany in terms of the industry perspective?
Yeah, let me add something to what Francis said that I think it's really important, and I think we share the views here. So as Seed Innovations, the investment fund where I work and that is listed in the London Stock Exchange, we cannot invest in recreational companies at the moment because we are regulated by the FCA in the UK, and UK investors are probably familiar with the Proceeds of Crime Act that doesn't allow us to invest in recreational companies, basically. But this is still extremely bullish for us because of the changes that it could have in the medical market first, the new government, I mean. And Franzi made some very good points there. And I would add that we could even expect some minor but perhaps meaningful reforms of the medical program that would improve access to medical cannabis in Germany, and for which there would be literally no opposition. I don't think anyone would oppose that within Germany, or at least not in a big way. And I don't think there would be any international opposition to that as well. So it could be a very easy win for the new government to say, hey, we are improving things for patients. Now the medical program in Germany works better. More patients have access to it. Insurers do not reject as many applications for reimbursement as they do now, and a bunch of different things that could be improved in the medical part of the industry.
And sorry, Alfredo, when you mean improved, do you mean access is widened, so the rules are relaxed or broadened in some way to increase usage?
In a way, yes. I mean, I don't have here again the crystal ball in terms of what could be done, but I think one of the key things that is limiting the growth of the German market is the fact that it is not extremely, but it's difficult to get cannabis reimbursed unless you have an extremely serious condition, not a serious condition, but an extremely serious condition, and cannabis is really used as last resort. I think there's some consensus, at least within the parties of the new government, that could and should be improved, because it was not the intention of the law in 2017 to have about a third of the applications for reimbursement being rejected. The law, Francie will correct me if I am wrong, but basically doing a quick translation stated that applications for reimbursement could only be rejected in exceptional cases. And 1/3 of rejections seems to be a little bit more than exceptional rejections. So I think that's one key thing that the new government could try to find a way to improve, broadening access to patients, and of course benefiting the medical cannabis industry in Germany, and literally without any meaningful opposition. So yeah, as investors invested in the German medical cannabis sector, the news of the new government, I would say, are good news, regardless of what happens with recreational or how long it takes.
I totally agree. You're super right. And I mean, the train has left the station. I agree totally that insurance is kind of rejected for maybe mostly formal reasons, right? Because it's a new procedure. But what the government already did to take care of that, they said, well, insurance, if you don't answer within a certain period of time, any application is deemed approved. And now we hear about new, and it's called like kind of selective contracts in some areas, where they discuss to get rid of all the approval scheme at all. Because in the end, this is lots of work for the doctor, but also for the insurance itself, right? And we see that there's a change going to be happen, because they're realizing, well, in the end, and Alfredo, you're super right, these patients are sick. So it's very, very likely that they already have a medication. So it's not that they're not taking anything. And cannabis could be maybe an additional medication and maybe also a substitution of an existing medication. And this is why now I think insurances look at cannabis in a different way. But I totally agree. We have to work on that and focus that patients who really need and not just quote unquote want the product get a secure access to it. That's really a crucial point for us at Khiron.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you're seeing it in the context of medical. And I mean, again, there is so little detail that I think we all naturally will gravitate to what's happening in medical to find some sort of idea of how this might roll out. I mean, Franzi, do you think the German authorities will look to North America, for example? Obviously, it's the biggest kind of industry on a financial basis, but do you think they'll look to North America on what to do, and maybe importantly, what not to do as well in terms of policy?
Exactly. So I generally hope that our government is not trying to reinvent the wheel, but just looking at other countries also, like, as you said, Luxembourg, Netherlands, which is quite close. Obviously also at the US or maybe Canada. But I think the main difference is, and this is what I really want to emphasize, is when we do the legalization, we shouldn't forget that we still have this medical scheme. And on the medical side, we have this full reimbursement. And this is, I think, where you cannot compare the situation here in Germany and also in US, America, or in Canada, because the medical part is reimbursed, and it will still be reimbursed. And I think this is something which is lacking in Canada. So I hope they're looking into what went good and what went wrong. But the complete comparison to the US and to Canada is, for me, it's not appropriate, because the scheme is very different. Because we now have a situation, for example, in Canada, that real patients go to the recreational scheme because it's not reimbursed under the medical scheme. And this is not going to happen in Germany because in 2017, Germany decided that cannabis is a regular treatment under the health insurance. So the government is going to pay for it. And this decision has never been taken in the US and in Canada. And this fundamental difference will have implications on the law. So I will hope they will looking into it, but I don't think it's a comparable situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really important to underline that the health insurance reimbursement, which is crucial to this and a key difference. And sticking on the theme of North America, Alfredo, do you see a kind of influx of North American capital with sort of renewed interest in Germany? I'm certainly speaking to a few people whose interest has been piqued, let's say.
Yeah, there's a lot of, perhaps the right word now is curiosity. I don't see an influx of capital already being invested in German cannabis companies, let's say, just because of the coalition agreement. But there's a renewed interest, certainly. And of course, whenever we will have some more certainty around how Germany will legalize cannabis, the big North American firms will not want to miss that. And some will probably start making their bets as soon as possible. Of course, riskier because we are uncertain about the timelines, but also maybe better to be first and place your bets soon.
Yeah.
Maybe it's also good to look at the Netherlands regarding North American interest, because of course probably next year the experiment with regulated supply of cannabis to the coffee shops in 10 cities will start, and there will be 10 companies, cultivators, contracted to supply those coffee shops, and you can already see that Canadian companies are moving in. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing. I'm not particularly fond of the way it's going in Canada. I'm more in favor of smaller companies working for the local market. But you see it coming in. You see that they're already trying to take over companies that have a license to supply the coffee shops. In that sense, it's also interesting to look further in the Netherlands, because that is one thing, the experiment that will start probably next year. It depends a little bit of when we finally get a government. We're already, the elections in the Netherlands were way before the Germans, and we still don't have a new coalition government. But there is also a law pending in the Senate in the Netherlands that would extend that experiment to the whole country. It's not sure if it will pass, but that we'll probably know in the next couple of months. And that would also change the whole scenario, also in Europe, of course, for what's happening. With all the talk about, in a lot of countries, about legally regulating cannabis, the only country in Europe where you can walk into a shop, look at what's available on your menu, hashish from Morocco, whatever, is in the Netherlands. And it's still the only place where you can do that in Europe. And that is also another point which is maybe interesting to look at, is will import-export be allowed? So if Canadian companies or North American companies want to operate in Germany, they probably have to set up a company in Germany itself because of the international restrictions, which is a very bad thing. We see, for instance, in the Netherlands, we see that all these coffee shops are not allowed to buy any foreign-made cannabis anymore. For instance, the hashish market in the Netherlands is still 20 to 25%. But yeah, there, Moroccan hashish will not be allowed to be sold in the coffee shops who participate in the experiment, which is, because of the international restrictions on import and export, which is, of course, very bad for the traditional small farmers in Morocco, because they are going to lose a substantial part of their market. And it's also a little bit strange because, why should you have indoor cannabis with a big carbon footprint while it's grown outdoors in Morocco and they make an excellent hashish, which the Dutch cannot make? So there are also all kinds of complications there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. A lot of these rules are, this is the type of thing where we're talking about how complex it is and how much needs to be thought through. And ultimately, there's not the choice that you could have if there were no restrictions. Tom, if I can just actually, now you've expanded it to the wider European context, how do you think this will affect wider European drug policy? So do you think other countries will be looking at Germany and thinking, actually, this is really interesting? Or are they going to be like, you're crazy?
No, other countries are always looking at Germany, what's happening there, because basically the most important country in Europe. Yeah, this will have a big influence, I think. It will bolden Luxembourg again to maybe expand and go back to their original proposal. It might help to pass the new law in the Netherlands, although how that is framed is a little bit different than legalization. Is basically extending the toleration of cannabis sales at the front door of coffee shops to the buying of cannabis at the back door. It will not be fully legal, but it will be allowed, as everything in the Netherlands with cannabis. But it will bolden also, it will change the situation in the Netherlands. The discussion in Denmark will be affected. Copenhagen has for many years tried to have a pilot project, but that was not allowed by the central government. Now that Germany is going, maybe they will allow it. Well, Italy will have a referendum next year on its limited proposal, basically home cultivation. But basically Germany borders on almost every other European country, so it will have an impact. And the most important one will be, what is going to happen in France? And it's not that things are not moving in France. There has been a parliamentary hearing that was clearly in favor of regulating cannabis, and that was led by people from Macron's party. But Macron has stopped all that, but the discussion is ongoing in France. So how that will turn out is difficult to say because now it's election time, of course, in France, and everybody tries to be on the right as far as possible, it seems. Macron already said that there will be no talk about cannabis regulation. But everybody will have to deal with Germany legally regulating if they do it. Every country in Europe will have to deal with that.
Yeah, and I think it's useful that it's the most powerful country in Europe who are trying to do this because it makes it harder for people to argue with, I guess, in certain ways because of complex relationships. I'm very conscious of time, guys, so I'm going to wrap it up here, but we could have easily talked for a lot longer, and I'm really glad for you guys all taking the time to share your views because it's a very important subject. Everyone's very excited, and I think if there's any takeaways from this, it's that we're all happy that things are moving in the right direction. We don't know how quickly they'll move, but it's a positive step. So thank you, guys.
That was a good wrap up.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was a really nice, interesting discussion. And thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.